The day we buried my mother, Diane Calloway wore white. Not ivory. Not cream. White, a fitted blazer and pencil skirt, pressed and deliberate, like she had stood in front of her closet that morning and made a choice. She moved through my mother's living room accepting condolences with practiced solemnity, her hand resting on my father's arm the way a woman rests her hand on something she owns. A gesture so smooth, so rehearsed, that most of the 60 people filling that house probably didn't notice it at all. I noticed it. I notice everything. My name is Nora Calloway. I'm 32 years old, and I work as a financial auditor, which means I spend my days finding the thing people don't want found. The number that doesn't balance. The transfer that happened on a Tuesday when no one was looking. The signature that's slightly too perfect to be genuine. I'm good at it. I am very good at it. But the thing about spending your career hunting for fraud is that it sharpens your eye for everyone except the people you've known your whole life. The people you love. The people you trusted before you understood that trust, like anything of value, can be systematically exploited. My mother, June Calloway, died on a Tuesday in September. Ovarian cancer. Stage 4, diagnosed 22 months before the end. She knew what was coming long before the rest of us could say the word out loud, and she spent those 22 months doing two things: loving me without reservation, and preparing. That's the word for it. Preparing. I didn't fully understand what she meant by that until the day of her funeral, when Diane Calloway stepped away from the condolence line, walked to the center of the living room, and asked 60 grieving people for their attention. If you've ever watched someone use a funeral as a stage, if you know the particular cold feeling of sitting in a room full of mourners and realizing that someone in that room is performing instead of grieving, hit like and subscribe before we go any further. Drop your city in the comments. I want to know where you're watching from. Stay with me, because what happened in that living room, and what my mother had already set in motion before she ever closed her eyes, is a story I have been waiting to tell since the afternoon it unfolded. Let me take you back 24 years, to the summer of 1999, because you need to understand what this family looked like before Diane entered it. My parents, June and Patrick Calloway, divorced when I was 8 years old. It wasn't a dramatic split. No screaming, no broken dishes, no affair I was ever told about. They were simply two people who had grown in different directions, and by the time they acknowledged it, the distance between them was too wide to close. My father moved to an apartment on the east side of town. My mother stayed in the house on Linden Drive, a 3-bedroom Cape Cod on a quiet block of maples and old sidewalks. I spent weekdays with Mom and weekends with Dad, and for several years, it worked the way a careful arrangement works. Steadily, if not warmly. June Calloway was a pediatric nurse. She worked 32 years at Mercy General, the last 14 in the NICU, caring for infants who arrived in the world already fighting. She was built for that work. Quiet, steady, precise, the kind of person who doesn't panic when the alarms go off because she has already run through every scenario and is 3 steps ahead. She applied that same quality to everything in her life. She meal prepped on Sundays. She paid off the Linden Drive mortgage in 24 years instead of 30. She maxed her 401k contributions from the year I started kindergarten. She drove a 2009 Honda Civic until the odometer hit 187,000 miles, and then she drove it some more. My mother was not rich. She was disciplined. There is a difference, and the difference is decades of unglamorous choices made in the right direction. By the time she was diagnosed in November of 2021, June Calloway had built the following: a house on Linden Drive appraised at $284,000, a retirement account holding $147,000, and a $400,000 life insurance policy through her employer, a policy she had maintained, without exception, for 26 years. My father remarried in 2012. Her name was Diane Pierce before the wedding, and after it she became Diane Calloway, a name she wore, I would come to understand, with the deliberateness of someone who had always wanted it. I was 21 when I met Diane for the first time. She was 40 then, attractive in a curated way, The kind of woman who has a skincare shelf arranged by step and a schedule for everything. She was warm to me, initially. Interested, even. She asked about my college courses, my goals, the professor I'd mentioned in passing 3 weeks earlier. I thought, at the time, that she was genuinely kind. I was still learning the difference between kindness and strategy. The shift happened slowly. It always does, with people like Diane. Not all at once, not in a way that could be named or confronted. But over the years, certain patterns emerged. When I called my father about something difficult, a hard week, a problem I was working through, Diane was almost always audible in the background. Not loudly. Just present. A murmur that redirected. Dad, I noticed, became harder to reach. His calls got shorter. When I visited, Diane had filled the weekend, dinners with her friends, errands that needed running, in ways that made my presence feel like an intrusion rather than a homecoming. By the time I was 26, I was spending holidays with my mother and texting my father on his birthday. I told myself it was the natural drift between a grown child and a parent who had moved on. That I was being too sensitive. That Diane wasn't doing anything, exactly, she was just there, and her presence had simply changed the shape of things. My mother never said a word against Diane. Not once, in all the years of co-navigating whatever my father's remarriage had made of things. When I vented once, after a particularly hollow Christmas at my father's house where Diane had spent the afternoon making pointed remarks about my apartment and my salary and my choice of career, my mother listened. She nodded. She poured more tea. And then she said, quietly, "Some people show you who they are by what they want. Pay attention to what Diane wants." I didn't understand what she meant at the time. I do now. Because what Diane wanted, it turned out, was my mother's $400,000. And she had been positioning to take it for longer than I had ever imagined. When my mother was diagnosed, I moved back to Linden Drive. Not permanently, I kept my apartment on the other side of town, but I was there most nights, every weekend, and every week when she had chemotherapy. I cooked. I drove her to Mercy General and waited in the chair beside the infusion chair and drove her home again. I held her hand at 2 in the morning over a hospital basin and called it a Tuesday, because that was what it was, and naming it anything else wouldn't have helped either of us. My father came twice in 22 months. Once in December of 2021, 3 weeks after the diagnosis, for about 90 minutes, during which Diane called 4 times and he answered twice. The second time was in March of 2023, near the end, when my mother's palliative care nurse had reached out to say it was close. He sat with her for 40 minutes. He held her hand. He left before dinner. Both times, Diane waited in the car. I am not telling you this to make you hate my father. Patrick Calloway is not a cruel man. He is a weak one, and weakness inside a marriage to a woman like Diane has its own particular consequences. He had been managed so completely for so long that I don't think he knew anymore what he wanted independent of what she wanted. He had become an extension of her, and what Diane wanted, as I was about to learn, was more specific and more calculated than I had given her credit for. In February of 2023, 6 months before my mother died, her attorney, Sandra Bloom, estate and probate specialist, 20 years in practice, received a phone call from a civil litigation attorney named Jeffrey Walsh. Walsh was calling on behalf of Patrick and Diane Calloway. He informed Sandra that his clients intended to assert a claim against the estate of June Calloway upon her death, based on the assertion that Patrick Calloway was the named beneficiary on a $400,000 life insurance policy my mother had carried through her employer for 26 years, and had allegedly never changed. Sandra thanked him for the notice. She took careful notes. And then she called my mother. I was in the kitchen when that call ended. I heard my mother's voice through the door, not the content, just the register, that particular tone she had when she was concentrating very hard on something. I came to the doorway. She looked up at me, and she said, "I need to tell you some things. And I need you to listen without interrupting." I sat down. When your father and I divorced, my mother said, the settlement included a clause. Standard language for the time. It stated that Patrick waived all rights, claims, or interests in any financial assets I accumulated after the date of filing. That includes inheritance, savings, and insurance benefits. He signed it in 1999. It is in the decree. Then what's the claim? I asked. They are arguing that the life insurance beneficiary designation supersedes the divorce decree because it is a contractual instrument, not a marital asset. Does it? My mother was quiet for a moment. Sandra says no. A group life insurance policy issued through an employer is governed by federal law, ERISA regulations. Under ERISA, a valid waiver of beneficiary rights in a divorce decree does hold. But proving it requires someone who knows that, who can document it, and who is prepared to move immediately when the claim surfaces. And Sandra's prepared? Sandra has been prepared since November. I looked at her. 22 months into a terminal cancer diagnosis, and she had been quietly assembling a legal defense for an estate she would never live to see settled. The grief of that sat in my throat in a way I didn't have words for. I swallowed it. I asked the next question. There's one more thing, my mother said. She told me that 18 months earlier, January of 2022, 2 months after her diagnosis, she had submitted a change of beneficiary form to Northwestern Mutual, the insurance company, formally designating me, Nora Calloway, as the sole beneficiary. She had sent it by certified mail with a return receipt requested. She had a copy of the form, a copy of the receipt, and a copy of the confirmation letter Northwestern Mutual had mailed back to Linden Drive in February of 2022. She pulled a folder from the kitchen drawer and laid it on the table in front of me. The confirmation was dated February 9, 2022. My name. Sole beneficiary. Then why does Patrick still show as beneficiary on the policy? I asked. My mother's expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes went still, the way things go still in a person who has made peace with a hard truth and is waiting for someone else to catch up. Because someone intercepted the confirmation letter, she said, and then filed a reversal. I stared at her. In March of 2022, she said, an email was sent to Northwestern Mutual's customer service department from an account I have never used and did not create. The email claimed to be from me. It stated that I had submitted a beneficiary change I wished to reverse, and it requested that the policy be returned to its original designation. Someone impersonated you. Someone submitted a reversal request in my name, yes. Northwestern Mutual processed it in compliance with their standard procedures. They sent the reversal confirmation to an address provided in the email, a post office box. I already knew before she said it, but I asked anyway. Whose post office box? Sandra ran the registration, my mother said. The box was opened in January of 2022, the same month I submitted the change. It is registered to Diane Calloway. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a car moved slowly down Linden Drive. A dog barked once and went silent. What my mother was describing was not a misunderstanding. It was not a bureaucratic error or a coincidence of timing. It was a sequence of deliberate acts, the opening of a post office box, the creation of a false email account, the impersonation of a dying woman to reverse a legal document, all executed with enough precision to pass Northwestern Mutual's verification process, and all pointing in one direction. That's fraud, I said. Multiple counts. That is Sandra's assessment as well, my mother said. She has preserved everything. The original submission with the certified mail receipt. The confirmation letter. The policy records showing the reversal. The email header data. The P.O. box registration. What do we do with it? My mother folded her hands on the table. Her hands were thinner than they used to be. The wedding ring she had never taken off after the divorce, not out of sentiment, she always said, but because it fit perfectly and she'd gotten used to it, caught the afternoon light. We wait, she said. Diane will not file quietly. She wants the money, but she also wants the performance. She wants people to see her taking it. Sandra will be at the service when the time comes. You let Diane speak. You let her finish. And then you let Sandra do her job. I looked at my mother across the kitchen table that had been in that house since before I was born, the table where she had helped me with homework and signed my permission slips and poured tea through 32 years of ordinary mornings, and I understood that she had known, from the moment the diagnosis came, that she was not just fighting cancer. She was fighting Diane. And she had made absolutely certain that she would win. The last 3 months of my mother's life were the most intimate and the most exhausting of mine. She was in hospice care from July, still at home on Linden Drive, which was exactly where she wanted to be. Sandra came to the house twice in those months. I met her in person for the first time in August, sitting at that same kitchen table. She was in her mid-50s, with short gray hair and the focused, unhurried manner of someone who had watched enough estates collapse to be finished with being surprised by people. She walked me through every piece of evidence in order, explained the legal framework in plain language, and answered every question I had without impatience. She also told me something my mother hadn't mentioned, that Sandra had hired a forensic document examiner in April, who had analyzed the email header data and confirmed that the email account used to impersonate my mother had been created from an IP address registered to an internet service provider in the zip code where my father and Diane lived. Not proof beyond a reasonable doubt. But enough. When Diane makes the claim, Sandra said, she will have Patrick's name on the current policy records. She'll present it as straightforward. She'll make it sound like a formality. She's counting on the room deferring to whoever sounds most certain. And you'll be in the room, I said. I will be at the service, Sandra confirmed. Your mother was very specific about that. On the last clear day my mother had, a Wednesday in late August when the light came through the bedroom curtains at a particular angle and she was more herself than she'd been in weeks, she looked at me and said, Sandra will be there. She knows what to do. You just have to let it happen. I told her I would. She nodded. She closed her eyes. She was asleep in 3 minutes. I sat beside her for another hour and thought about everything she had built and protected and prepared, not just the estate, not just the legal documents, but me. The version of me that knew how to sit still when every instinct said move. The version of me that understood, because she had taught me, that the most devastating response to someone who is counting on your panic is perfect, composed patience. My mother died 11 days before the funeral. She died in her own bed, in her own house, with her own name on the deed and her affairs exactly as she had arranged them. And on the morning of the service, before she drove to Linden Drive, Sandra Bloom texted me 2 words. I'm ready. The reception had been going for 40 minutes when Diane moved. I had been watching her the way I watch a file when I know the discrepancy is in there but haven't found it yet, not staring, not alerting, just present and attentive. She had worked the room in a specific pattern, extended family first, then my mother's colleagues from Mercy General, then the neighbors from the block. She had accepted every condolence with the same expression, sorrowful, gracious, slightly burdened, the expression of a woman managing a very difficult situation with admirable composure. My father stood beside her the entire time. He had not come to the kitchen, where I was. He had not looked for me. I had stopped expecting him to. Sandra was near the front door. She had arrived 20 minutes into the reception, introduced herself to 2 of my mother's nursing colleagues, and taken a position near the entrance with a glass of water and the quiet authority of someone who knew exactly how much time was left before they were needed. At 11:52, Diane stepped into the center of the living room. She cleared her throat. The room began to settle. 60 people, nurses, neighbors, a handful of distant cousins, my mother's friends from 30 years of Tuesday morning walks, turned toward her. I am so sorry to do this today, Diane said. Her voice was pitched perfectly, warm and reluctant, the voice of someone being forced by conscience to speak up. I know this is not the time any of us would choose. But there is a matter involving June's estate that has to be addressed before things move forward. And I think it's important that the people who loved her understand the full situation. The room was very quiet. I set my coffee cup down on the kitchen counter without a sound. I reached into my bag. Sandra's folder was there. Every document in order. Every certified copy exactly where it needed to be. I thought about my mother in August, in the bed on Linden Drive, in the particular afternoon light. Diane is theatrical. She'll want an audience. 60 people had just become Diane's audience. And Sandra Bloom had just taken one step forward from the door. If you're still with me, if you felt that shift in the room the way I did, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss part 2. Your support is what makes it possible for me to keep telling stories like this one. I'll see you in the next part. Diane had rehearsed this. I could tell by the way she moved, not the tentative movement of someone improvising under grief, but the measured, deliberate placement of a woman who had walked through the sequence in her head enough times to have ironed out every hesitation. She stepped to the center of the living room with the quiet authority of someone claiming a podium, and she waited just long enough for the last murmur to die before she spoke. Most of you knew June for years, she began. Her voice was soft, burdened, the voice of someone reluctant to be the bearer of difficult news. And I think you would agree that she would have wanted the people who loved her to understand the full picture of what she left behind. Not for any reason other than clarity. And out of respect for Patrick, who built a life with June before I ever came into it, and who has certain legal rights that I don't think anyone in this room would want overlooked. She paused. She let the pause do its work. Patrick is the named beneficiary on a $400,000 life insurance policy June carried through her employer for over 25 years. That is a matter of public record. She reached into the bag on her shoulder and produced a document, 3 pages, folded once, and held it up with the ease of someone who had been waiting a long time to hold it. This is the current policy designation on file with Northwestern Mutual. Patrick Calloway, primary beneficiary. No secondary listed. No changes filed. She looked at me. The look was not hostile. That was the more disturbing part. It was patient, the look of a woman who had already won and was simply waiting for the paperwork to confirm it. I know this is hard to hear today of all days, Diane said, turning back to the room. But Patrick has been very gracious. He has agreed to allow the estate attorney adequate time to review everything properly. He is not looking to create conflict. He simply wants what the law provides. She folded the documents and held them at her side. She had not raised her voice once. She had not been cruel, not visibly. She had been precise and sympathetic and utterly confident, and the 60 people in my mother's living room had heard every word of it in exactly the silence she had engineered. I watched my father. He was standing at the edge of the room, near the hallway entrance, his hands at his sides. He was not looking at me. He was looking at the floor just past Diane's left shoulder, the way a man looks when he has been told what to say and is waiting to be told when to say it. My mother's colleagues from Mercy General were watching Diane with carefully neutral expressions. 2 of them exchanged a glance. Mrs. Hargrove from 3 doors down, who had brought a lasagna that morning and had known my mother for 22 years, was very still in her chair by the window, her hands folded in her lap. Nobody moved. And that was the moment I understood what my mother had known all along, that Diane wasn't just making a legal claim. She was making a social one. She was establishing the story before anyone else could. She was doing what people like Diane do best, arriving first, speaking with authority, and trusting that the room would accept the version given to it most confidently. It is a strategy that works, again and again, on every room except one. A room where the other person was prepared. I looked across the living room at Sandra Bloom. Sandra had not moved from her position near the front door. She was holding her glass of water with both hands, watching Diane with the same expression she'd probably worn in 100 courtrooms, not cold, not combative, just present. Alert. She met my eyes, and she gave me a single, small nod. I stepped out of the kitchen doorway and into the living room. There is a version of this moment I had imagined in the dark, in the months when my mother was sleeping and I was awake and the fear of what was coming sat on my chest like a stone. In that imagined version, I was furious. I was shaking. I raised my voice and said something cutting and sharp, and people gasped and Diane flinched and the room understood immediately who was right. That is not what happened. What happened was quieter, and because of that, it was permanent. I walked to the center of the room, not to where Diane was standing, but beside the fireplace, beside the framed photograph of my mother at 43, smiling at a camera in Glacier National Park, her hair windswept and her eyes squinting against the sun. The photo she had chosen herself, years ago, and told me was the one she wanted used. "Thank you, Diane," I said. My voice was even. "I'd like to add some context." Diane's expression shifted, not much, just enough. A tightening at the corners of her mouth. She had expected tears, or silence, or a fumbling protest. She had not expected composure. "Most of you don't know Sandra Bloom," I said, turning slightly toward the door. "She's been my mother's estate attorney for the past 3 years. My mother asked her to be here today specifically. Sandra, would you come forward?" Sandra set her water glass on the side table by the door and crossed the room. She opened her briefcase as she walked, unhurried, practiced, the movements of someone who has done this exact thing in smaller and larger rooms for 20 years, and by the time she reached me, she had a folder in her hand. The room was completely silent. "Diane is correct that Patrick Calloway currently appears as the named beneficiary on the Northwestern Mutual policy," Sandra said. She did not need to raise her voice. The room was doing the work for her. "She is also correct that this is a matter of public record. What she has not mentioned are 2 additional matters of record that significantly change the legal picture." She opened the folder and withdrew the first document. The first is the Calloway divorce decree, filed in Logan County in August of 1999 and signed by both parties. She held it up, then placed it on the coffee table where anyone in the nearest chairs could see it. Section 7, Paragraph 3 of that decree contains an explicit waiver. Patrick Calloway waived, in writing and under oath, all rights, claims, and financial interests in any assets accumulated by June Calloway after the date of filing. That waiver is broad, it is unambiguous, and under Illinois law, it applies to insurance proceeds. Sandra's voice was as level as a table. "He signed it 25 years ago. It has not been reversed. It has not been amended." The room absorbed this. My father's eyes came up from the floor. Diane's chin lifted by a fraction of an inch. "That document is from 1999, she said. Her voice was still controlled, but the warmth had left it. "The policy designation is current. A current beneficiary designation supersedes, under ERISA," Sandra said, without looking at her. "A valid waiver executed in a divorce decree does hold against a pre-existing beneficiary designation. That has been affirmed consistently in federal case law. But the question of whether Patrick is the current beneficiary is also somewhat different than Diane has suggested." She withdrew the second document from the folder. On January 14, 2022, June Calloway submitted a change of beneficiary form to Northwestern Mutual by certified mail, designating her daughter, Nora Calloway, as sole primary beneficiary. That form was received, processed, and confirmed by Northwestern Mutual in a letter dated February 9, 2022. She placed that document on the coffee table beside the first one. "Nora has the original certified mail receipt, the return confirmation, and the letter. All 3. I set them on the table." Mrs. Hargrove leaned forward very slightly in her chair. "Then why does the current policy show Patrick?" Diane asked. Her voice was still level, but the pace of it had changed, slightly faster, slightly tighter, the rhythm of a person beginning to calculate rather than perform. "Because in March of 2022, Sandra said, someone submitted a reversal request to Northwestern Mutual by email, claiming to be June Calloway and requesting that the beneficiary designation be returned to its original form. Northwestern Mutual processed that request in good faith. The confirmation was sent to a post office box provided in the email." Sandra paused. "Just long enough. That post office box was registered in January of 2022, the same month June submitted her change, to Diane Calloway. The room did not gasp. It went still. Which is worse? Not a dramatic stillness, the intimate, dangerous stillness of people who are very quietly realizing that they have been standing in the wrong story. Mrs. Hargrove's hands, folded in her lap, slowly tightened against each other. The two nurses from Mercy General, Carol Ewan and Beth Massey, who had worked beside my mother for 16 and 11 years respectively, were looking at Diane with the careful, unblinking attention of women who spend their professional lives monitoring for the moment something changes. My father was staring at Sandra. He had gone the color of old chalk. Diane set her jaw. "That is a very serious accusation," she said. "It is a documented sequence of events," Sandra replied. "We have the email header data, which was analyzed by a forensic document specialist in April of this year. The account used to impersonate June Calloway was created from an IP address assigned to an internet service provider in the zip code where you and Patrick currently reside. We have the P.O. box registration with your name and your signature. We have the timeline, the certified mail receipt, and the policy records showing the reversal that followed." She held Diane's gaze. "These documents are in the hands of Northwestern Mutual's Fraud Investigation Unit as of last Thursday. They are also with the Illinois Department of Insurance." Diane opened her mouth. Nothing came out. It was the first time in 12 years I had seen Diane Calloway without a sentence ready. My father took a step forward. His voice, when it came, was hollow. "Diane, what, Patrick?" Diane turned to him, and for just a moment the performance dropped entirely. What replaced it was not guilt, not remorse, it was the raw, practical alarm of someone doing rapid structural calculations. "This is not the place, you told me the form was never filed." His voice was not loud. It was worse than loud, it was the voice of a man understanding something for the first time. "You told me June never changed it. You said you'd spoken to the insurance company. Patrick, this is not the conversation, did you do this?" He was looking at her the way you look at a piece of paper that has just told you something that cannot be untold. "Did you, Patrick?" Her voice dropped and sharpened simultaneously. It was the voice she used when she needed him to stop. The voice that had worked on him, I suspected, for 12 years. It did not work now. He looked away from her. He looked at me. And then Patrick Calloway, who had driven to Mercy General twice in 22 months and left before dinner both times, who had stood in the corner of his daughter's grief for 2 hours without crossing the room to find her, sat down slowly in the nearest chair and put his face in his hands. The room waited. I had thought about what I would say in this moment. I had rehearsed sentences in my head, the way you do when you have too much time alone with a fear. I had imagined accusations, explanations, the full cataloging of every specific wrong. I had imagined a version of me that was articulate and righteous and devastating. What came out was none of that. I looked at Diane, at this woman in white in my mother's living room, with my mother's furniture around her and my mother's photographs on the walls behind her and my mother's 60 people watching, and I said 7 words. My mother knew. She made sure of it. That was all. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of everything those 7 words contained: 26 years of a policy maintained without fail, 2 years of preparation with a woman who could not afford to leave anything to chance, a folder built document by document, layer by layer, by hands that were already getting thinner. It was full of my mother choosing, in the last lucid months of her life, to spend her diminishing energy not on rage or grief but on making certain that the truth would be in the room when it needed to be. Diane looked at me for a long moment. Then she looked at Sandra. Then she looked at the documents on the coffee table, neat, ordered, irrefutable, carrying my mother's name and my mother's signature and my mother's quiet, devastating foresight, and something shifted in her face. Not remorse. Diane was not built for remorse. It was the particular expression of a person recalculating the terrain and finding that every route they had mapped is now closed. "We should go," she said to Patrick. Her voice was flat. The performance was over. There was nothing left to perform for. Patrick didn't move immediately. He was still in the chair, still looking at his hands. One of the Mercy General nurses, Beth Massey, reached over and put a hand on his shoulder. It was a small gesture, reflexive, the kind of gesture that people who spend their lives caring for the sick give without thinking. Patrick flinched slightly, then stilled. Diane walked to the front door. She did not say goodbye. She did not offer her condolences to me, or thank anyone for coming, or attempt a single word to the room she had stood in front of 5 minutes earlier with such absolute confidence. She opened the door and walked out, and the sound of her heels on the porch steps was the only sound in the house for a full 10 seconds after she was gone. Then Mrs. Hargrove spoke. "Nora," she said. Her voice was very quiet, very direct. "Your mother would be proud of you." I didn't trust myself to answer that. I nodded once. Patrick stood up, eventually. He stood at the edge of the room for a moment, looking at no one in particular, and then he walked to where I was standing by the fireplace. He stopped a few feet away. He looked at the photograph of my mother in Glacier National Park. "I didn't know," he said. "I want you to know that I didn't know she had done that." I believed him. I don't think that made it better. But I believed him. "You should go be with your wife," I said. He flinched, very slightly. Then he nodded. He walked to the door, and he left, and I stood in my mother's living room and let the next breath come. Carol Ewan was the first to stand up. Then Beth. Then Mrs. Hargrove. People moved toward me in the quiet, careful way people move toward someone they don't want to overwhelm but can't leave standing alone. Someone put a cup of hot tea in my hand. Someone else said something about June that made 3 people nearby smile through tears. Sandra was at my side. "I'll be filing the formal complaint with Northwestern Mutual's fraud division first thing Monday," she said, low enough that only I could hear. "The reversal will be voided. The policy reverts to the February 2022 designation." "That's you." "And the waiver?" I asked. The waiver in the divorce decree means Patrick's claim had no legal standing regardless of what the policy showed. "We'll be notifying Jeffrey Walsh's office formally tomorrow." I nodded. "Your mother was very thorough," Sandra said. It was not a compliment in the ordinary sense. It was the specific acknowledgement one professional gives another for work done at a very high standard. "She always was," I said. The hours after a funeral are strange in a way that ordinary grief language doesn't quite cover. The people who matter stay. The people who came out of obligation begin to find their coats around 3 o'clock. The house gradually quiets, and what's left is the particular silence of a place where someone used to live. By 4 that afternoon, it was just me, Sandra, Carol, Beth, and Mrs. Hargrove. Carol had put a pot of my mother's coffee on. She knew where everything was in that kitchen, had probably made coffee in it a dozen times, and we sat around the table where so many things had been said and decided and quietly prepared over the last 2 years. Nobody talked about Diane, not directly. We talked about June. We talked about the time she had single-handedly talked a terrified NICU father through a 3 a.m. crisis that was not, technically, her shift. We talked about her garden and her handwriting and the fact that she had never once, in 32 years, been late for a shift. I let those stories fill the kitchen. My phone was in my pocket. I had turned it to silent before the service, and I left it that way until the last car pulled out of Linden Drive at 5:10. When I finally looked at it, there were 11 missed calls. 3 from my father's cell phone. 4 from an unknown number that I would later confirm was Jeffrey Walsh, who had apparently been briefed on the afternoon's events by the time he arrived at his Monday 9 a.m. coffee. 2 from my father's home number. And 2 from a number I didn't recognize at all, which turned out to be Diane's sister in Rockford, who had apparently heard about the funeral from someone who had been there and wanted to tell me, in a voicemail of 47 mostly fragmented sentences, that Diane had been under tremendous pressure lately and deserved some compassion. I deleted that one. I called Sandra from the back porch of Linden Drive as the sun went down behind the maple trees. The evening was cool, the particular cool of a September that has already decided to become autumn. Monday morning, she confirmed. The formal complaint goes to Northwestern Mutual's Special Investigations Unit. Based on the documentation we have, the email header data, the P.O. box registration, the timeline, they will open their own investigation. That is separate from any action you choose to take civilly or criminally. What does criminally look like? I asked. Identity fraud for impersonating June in the email. Mail fraud for the P.O. box scheme. Attempted insurance fraud for the reversal. Potentially elder financial abuse, depending on the state attorney's interpretation. Those are the categories. The DA's office is not obligated to pursue, but the documentation is strong enough that they would have a viable case if they chose to. I was quiet for a moment, looking at the maple trees, which were just beginning to turn. What did my mother want? I asked. Sandra paused. Your mother asked me to pursue every legal avenue necessary to protect the estate. She did not specify prosecution. She said. Sandra paused again, and when she continued, her voice had shifted slightly, the professional inflection giving way to something more careful. She said she wanted the truth to have consequences. Not punishment. Consequences. I thought about that distinction for a long time after I hung up. The first 72 hours after the funeral moved the way the aftermath of large events always moves, in a series of sharp developments separated by stretches of exhausted stillness. Monday morning, Sandra filed the formal fraud complaint with Northwestern Mutual. By Monday afternoon, the company had acknowledged receipt and opened an internal investigation. By Tuesday, the policy's beneficiary designation had been placed under administrative hold, which meant no disbursement to anyone until the investigation concluded, but which also meant that Diane's reversal was, for all practical purposes, already nullified. Jeffrey Walsh called Sandra on Tuesday and informed her that his clients were withdrawing their claim against the estate. He did not offer an explanation. He did not need to. On Wednesday morning, the director of nursing at Mercy General called me. She had been at the funeral. She had seen the documents on the coffee table. She told me that June had been one of the most respected nurses on the floor for 3 decades, and that what had happened at the service, what had been attempted, was something the hospital community was aware of. She did not say more than that, but she asked if there was anything the hospital could do in support of the estate proceedings. I thanked her. I told her I would be in touch. That same Wednesday, I received an email from a woman named Helen Garrett, who was the office manager for a small nonprofit where Diane had been volunteering for the past 4 years. Helen had been at the funeral. She had seen everything. She had spoken to the board chair that morning. The email said, simply, that Diane's volunteer position had been placed on hold pending a review of the circumstances, and that they hoped I was being supported during this difficult time. I did not reply immediately. I sat with the email for a long time, thinking about what my mother had said. Not punishment. Consequences. There is a difference. I had not fully understood it until that week. Punishment is something you do to a person in anger or in vindication. Consequences are what happen when the truth is simply allowed to move at its own pace through the world, and the world, given accurate information, adjusts accordingly. I had not called Diane's volunteer organization. I had not contacted Helen Garrett. I had not spoken to a single person about what Diane had done except Sandra and, in the kitchen at the end of the day, the women who had loved my mother. The consequences were not mine. They were the natural result of 60 people seeing what they saw, and knowing what they knew, and going back to their lives with that knowledge. Diane had wanted an audience. She had gotten one. On Thursday morning, my father called. He had called 3 times on Sunday, which I had not answered. This time, I picked up. He was quiet for a long moment on his end. I could hear the house behind him, the particular sound of a home in the middle of a weekday morning, and I wondered what those rooms felt like to him right now. I want you to know, he said, that I am speaking to Jeffrey Walsh about settling the estate without contest. Whatever Sandra needs from me to clear the record, I'll provide it. I appreciate that, I said. Another silence. Then, I didn't know about the P.O. box. I need you to understand that. I know, Dad. I should have, he stopped. Started again. I should have come more. Those 2 years. I should have been there. I had practiced this conversation in my head too, the way I had practiced the living room. In my practice version, I had said many true and precise things about the 2 years of Tuesdays and the 22 months of treatment and the 40 minutes he had sat with her near the end while Diane waited in the car. I had said them quietly and accurately and with enormous restraint, and in my practiced version they had landed the way they deserved to. I said none of them. She knew you loved her, Patrick, I said. And then, because it was also true, she never stopped knowing that. He made a sound on the other end of the phone that I can't describe. I gave him a moment. Then I told him I had to go, and I hung up, and I sat in the kitchen of the house on Linden Drive for a long time with the phone in my hands. Outside, the maple trees were turning in earnest now. The whole block was going golden orange and that particular dark red that happens right before the leaves decide to fall. My mother had planted those trees. 31 years ago, the spring she moved in, 2 saplings in 2 holes she dug herself on a Saturday afternoon. I looked at them for a while. Then I made coffee, and I sat at the kitchen table, and I began the work of inheriting everything she had built. If this story has you on the edge of your seat, if you felt every beat of that living room, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on so you don't miss part 3. Your support means everything and helps me keep bringing you stories like this one. The investigation closed 6 weeks after the funeral. Northwestern Mutual voided the fraudulent reversal, reinstated the February 2022 designation, and disbursed the $400,000 policy to me, Nora Calloway, sole beneficiary, exactly as my mother had filed it on a January morning when she was 2 months into a terminal diagnosis and still thinking clearly enough to protect the people she loved. The Illinois Department of Insurance referred the matter to the state attorney's office. I was contacted once, gave a statement, and was told the documentation was sufficient to proceed. I did not attend any hearings. I did not need to. I had done my part the day I stood beside Sandra in my mother's living room and let the truth speak at its own volume. Diane and Patrick separated 4 months later. I did not learn this from my father. I learned it the way you learn things in small towns, through a neighbor, through a quiet word, through the particular way information moves when people already know what happened and are simply waiting to confirm it. My father called me in December. We talked for 45 minutes, which was longer than we had talked in years. He asked if we could have dinner sometime. I said yes. I meant it carefully, not warmly, the way you agree to something that will take time to become what it's supposed to be. We are not repaired. We are, cautiously, beginning. I used part of the money to pay off the house on Linden Drive. The title is mine now. I kept the furniture the way it was. I kept the kitchen table. I kept the photograph of my mother in Glacier National Park above the fireplace, her hair windswept, her eyes squinting against a sun she could not have known she had so few years left to feel. Some nights I sit at that table with a cup of tea and feel her absence in the room the way you feel a sound after it stops, not as silence exactly, but as the shape the sound used to fill. I miss her every day. I am also, for the first time in a long time, not afraid of anything. That is what she gave me. Not the $400,000, not the house, not the legal preparation that dismantled Diane in front of 60 people on a September afternoon, though all of that mattered, and I will not pretend it didn't. What she gave me was the proof that a quiet person, a careful person, a person who does the work and says nothing and waits, is not a weak person. She was the most powerful person in that room. She just wasn't there to see it. She didn't need to be. She had already done everything. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If this story stayed with you, check out the videos on your screen now, I think you'll love them. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. See you in the next story.